This presentation will continue the previous case on MMORPGs and show how requirements can be defined in that context. Define requirements is the second activity in this process for design research. It takes as input an explicated problem, and as output it produces an outline of an artifact to be designed and developed, as well as requirements on this artifact. Here is what we arrived at in an earlier presentation. We started with a very vague initial problem, namely, players don't play MMORPGs as they should. We made this problem more precise and focused on quests, so we arrived at players don't complete their quests. And we also identified a couple of root causes of this more precise problem, namely that quests are boring and players are not motivated. In the Define Requirements activity, we will start from this explicated problem that quests are boring and players are not motivated. And we will, as output, produce an outline of an artifact that can address this problem, as well as requirements on that artifact. In this work, we will use research strategies and methods and maybe also more practice-based approaches. And as a knowledge base, we will make use of the previous research, but we will also make use of stakeholder interests and views. And there are two sub-activities in this Define Requirements activity, Outline Artifact and Elicit Requirements, and we will have a look at each of these. Outline Artifact is about sketching the artifact. We should choose an artifact type and then describe the artifact in broad overview. There are certainly lots of artifacts and solutions that could address this problem. Please, before moving on to the next slide, think about different artifacts that could be used in this context for addressing this explicated problem of quests are boring and players are not motivated. Well, one idea to address this problem is to construct an interesting quest giver. By the way, this idea was also the topic of a thesis at our department. A quest giver here is a non-playing character in a game that gives a quest to players. And it consists both of the character itself and the text for the question. And now it should be designed in such a way that it attracts the interest of the players so that it makes them more motivated and makes the game less boring. And for the type of this artifact, it's an instantiation. It's a specific quest giver that can be used in a particular MMORPG. Now, as we know which kind of artifact we're going to develop, it's time to elicit requirements, and this can be done by consulting the literature, engaging with stakeholders, and investigating existing artifacts. Consulting the literature means to read about the practice and the problem under consideration here, as well as previous ideas about requirements. It can be any source, it can be academic literature from the discipline of game studies. It can be white papers, say from gaming companies. It could be more generally about trade press, such as gaming magazines and websites. And it could come from many different other sources also. Another way of eliciting requirements is to engage with stakeholders. The straightforward approach is to ask stakeholders about their requirements, what they would like to suggest, but you could also ask them about their interests and opinions, and from these you could derive requirements. An important topic here is to decide which are the most important stakeholders to ask and to engage with. Of course, players are central here, but game developers can also be important, and there might be other stakeholders also, like family members of the players, or maybe the company that produces the game under consideration. Another way of eliciting requirements is to investigate existing artifacts, those that are similar to the artifact to be designed and developed. In this case, it would mean to investigate existing quest givers in MMORPGs. So you would learn about these existing quest givers by observing them, by reading about them, by checking out their looks and feels, how they behave, what they're saying, associated text, and so on. And from that, you could identify new requirements. When it comes to research methods for eliciting requirements, interviews are very common. And this means that you ask questions orally to some individual or to a group of individuals. An interview can be structured or semi-structured or unstructured. A structured interview means that you have predefined questions and predefined answers. In a semi-structured interview, you have your questions ready, but the respondents are able to formulate their own answers. In an unstructured interview, you rather let the respondents formulate and express themselves freely. The key issue here is how to select the respondents. For the case of the quest giver, we already talked about different stakeholders here, such as the players or the developers. But for example, for the players, should there be beginners, newcomers to the game, or should there be more of experienced players? Should there be some particular group that is important, some target group? So to select respondents needs to be decided at an early stage. Another issue here is how to formulate your questions so you get meaningful answers, in particular to avoid leading questions. A leading question is a question that is formulated in such a way that it encourages the respondent to answer in a particular way. For example, if you ask, "Do you get on well with your boss?" you somehow indicate that there is some problem in your relationship with your boss. Instead, you could ask this in a more neutral way, saying, for example, "Tell me about your relationship with your boss." The second example on this slide is about a collision between cars, and you can then ask, how fast was the red car going when it smashed into the blue car? And here you indicate that the red car was really going much too fast. Instead, you could formulate this in a neutral way. How fast was each car going when the accident happened? While interviews are about asking questions orally in an interaction between an interviewer and a respondent, the questionnaire is instead about asking questions through a written form. The issues here are quite similar to those in interviews. You need to decide between closed and open questions. The closed question is one where there are predefined answer alternatives that the respondent has to choose between. In an open question, where the respondent is instead able to formulate and express her own or his own answers. And in this case for questionnaires, you also need to be careful in selecting respondents and avoiding leading questions. Yet another way of eliciting requirements is to use observations, where you observe some phenomena. Here you can distinguish between systematic and participant observations. Systematic observations means that you have some predefined protocol according to which you carry out your observations, and you typically keep at arm length distance from the objects or the people that you observe. So for example, in the quest giver case, you could carry out some video recordings and study these video recordings and thereby observe players as they are playing and interacting with quest givers. Participant observation, on the other hand, means that you try to become a participant of the practice under consideration, and you perform and you're active in this practice together with other people. So for example, you try to become a player and you play together with other players in an MMORPG, and in that you try to observe how they interact with quest givers. And yet another research method for eliciting requirements is to use document studies, where you study documents that are used in some organization or some other context. It could be user manuals, strategy documents, system logs, social media feeds, websites, and so on. In fact, any data collection method can be used for eliciting requirements. Could be interviews as well as questionnaires, observations, and document studies. Before moving on, please think about useful data collection methods for eliciting requirements on the quest giver, and try to come up with some requirements yourself. This diagram shows some possible requirements on the quest giver. It should have a cool look, there should be choices between different quests, and there should be an interesting storyline. In the diagram, we have also assumed that interviews were used as a data collection method, and that psychology and game design were used as a knowledge base.